is a poem by K. Ryan from a collection called The Best of It. And this poem is titled The Things of the World. Wherever the eye lingers, it finds a hunger. The things of the world want us for dinner. Inside each pebble or leaf or puddle is a hook. The appetites of the world compete to catch a look. What does this mean? How does it work? Why aren't rocks complete? Why isn't green adequate to green? We aren't gods whose gaze could save, but that's how the things of the world behave. I am fascinated by that poem. And that's what poets do, is bring us perspectives that I don't think I would ever have otherwise. To imagine that the things of the world are vying for your attention and mine. That's why the trees put out colored leaves. That's why birds sing. They want us to pay attention. They're calling out to us to stop and take notice of them. That's what the poem suggests. And why not? If those things out there are invested with God's creativity and energy and love as we are, and we believe they are, then why not stop and pay attention? Why not honor them and admire them and even love them, certainly respect them? I like that. And once you hear something like that, it's hard to go back, and that's a good thing. Maybe we should read that poem every day. Maybe everybody in the world should read the poem every day. But that one line, why aren't rocks complete, is the one that I stumbled over, that stopped me. Why aren't rocks complete? Why do they need more? Maybe the incompletion is built into the system. Maybe the completion includes incompletion so that you and I need each other, and we need other things, and they need us. The temple in Jerusalem was a magnificent structure according to all reports. It was covered in white marble and gold, and according to one commentator, the dimensions were 5 football fields long and 3 football fields wide. Now, one of the participants in the Bible study on Tuesday morning, who shall remain nameless, but it was Art, said, "I didn't know that they had football back then." Which I thought was really quick. And I didn't think of it. It was probably European football, not American, because that's older, I think, and more what's accepted around the world, right? Anyway, that temple was built by Herod the Great, or Herod the Great Builder, and I think he called himself that and got other people to call him that. I don't know if you would call yourself Gene the Great, if that would catch on, but it might be worth a try. Who knows? But that temple was one of those things that called out for attention, that when you saw it, it spoke to you. You should stop and admire it in awe. And it was built that way. Well, one of the disciples, as Jesus and his disciples are coming out of the temple for the last time in what we call Holy Week. This is Jesus' last few moments in the temple. He's been arguing, disputing, discussing things with the religious leaders, and now they're leaving. And one of the disciples is taken by this structure. It's impressive, and he just has to stop for a moment. Just look at this thing. I mean, just before we go, we should maybe take some pictures or something. And Jesus says, "You're right. You should take pictures now, because it's not going to be there long." It's a human structure, and what goes up will come down, and this will come down. Now, the backdrop for this pronouncement, Mark writes in around the year 70, and the Jewish-Roman War is raging between 66 and 70. And this Jewish revolt takes place. Judea, Galilee, the whole region is in turmoil. They're trying to run the Romans out. And there's infighting amongst Jewish groups, the priests who don't want to get rid of the Romans because Well, they're in collaboration with them and the zealots who want to get rid of the Romans, and we should all fight to run them out. And they're battling back and forth amongst themselves as they battle the Romans. The Romans have their own issues. When they finally bust through the Romans in 70, in that first century of the Common Era, the conflagration brings the temple burning to the ground, and thousands upon thousands of Jewish lives come to an end. It's horrendous. That's what's going on as Mark is writing his version of the Jesus story. And that's the backdrop for this particular text and what Jesus says. Now, when he says, no stone will be left upon another, we realize Mark is writing this 40 years after Jesus' life. Did Jesus really say that? He may have. Jesus did, I think, believe that the end was coming, that there was a new creation in the works, and so the temple and everything would be replaced. Was it simply because it would be knocked down in this change, or was this a theological, political pronouncement on Jesus' part or on Mark's part? That this is what happens to structures when they don't honor God. This is what happens when the leaders of God's people reject God's chosen one. That would be part of Mark's argument, part of the argument of the early church, what's in what we call the New Testament. Well, whatever Jesus is saying there, it sort of stuns the disciples. And the curtain comes down. That's the end of that scene in the play. So if you imagine a stage curtain coming down, and then people backstage are scurrying around to change the scenery, because the next scene takes place outside of the city, on the Mount of Olives, which, if you read in Zechariah chapter 14, there's this passage where Zechariah predicts that this is where God will land when the final day comes. It's a tumultuous passage itself, but that's traditionally what is understood. The Mount of Olives is where God will arrive on the final day. And that is why, in part, Jesus comes into the city on what we call Palm Sunday from the Mount of Olives to sort of dramatize the coming of God into this city, whether God is accepted or not. Well, what Zechariah says about this day and this coming, Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, sitting over against the temple, Mark tells us. Just like in the previous story where Jesus was seated over against the temple treasury, remember, with the widow who put the 2 coins in? It's not simply where he's located geographically. It's, again, a theological, political position. Jesus seats himself, places himself over against the temple because of the temple corruption. And that is a large part of why he is as popular as he is. So he's made this pronouncement. And 4 of his disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, come to him privately. So this probably shouldn't be in the book, because this was just, there should have been executive privilege on this. It shouldn't have been revealed. But they ask, when will this happen, and how will we know that all of these things are about to be accomplished? Now, isn't it curious that they ask about all of these things? Because Jesus talks about one thing, doesn't he? At least the part that we hear. Or maybe there was more conversation, but he talks about the destruction of the temple. But they're asking about all of these things, which, doesn't it make you curious what all these things are? Jesus' response to them is equally interesting. He says there will be wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines and kingdoms rising against kingdom, and people claiming to be the leaders, claiming to be God's chosen one. Don't be led astray. That's not it. That's just what? The beginning. Well, the beginning of what? Well, the beginning of the end, the beginning of the beginning. He says this is the beginning of the birth pangs. So labor begins. In a passage, I think it's in Romans, Paul talks about all creation groaning as if in labor, waiting for the children of God to be revealed, to be born. Is Mark reflecting that? Perhaps. But what Jesus talks about and describes feel and sound like endings, don't they? Wars, rumors of wars, kingdoms rising against kingdom. This is great disruption, pain, death. And the word that the disciples use to talk about all these things being accomplished is soon telestai. Soon telestai. I have to read it because it won't stick in my head. Soon telestai. And the root word is telos. Soon telostai. And the telos is like in a telescope, it is the goal far out there, down in the future, when all these things will be accomplished. There was a theologian in the last century, 1900s, named Teilhard de Chardin, who talked about the omega point, the telos, and that God is calling and inviting and beckoning and drawing all of creation, all of history to this omega point, alpha, omega, beginning and end, to this point of completion, of consummation. Everything coming into one, into completion within God's self. And Desjardins said God is already at that point, inviting all into God's self. Beyond time, at the end of time, however you conceive of that. I was intrigued by that when I first heard about that idea way back in college. Astrophysicists tell us that the universe, or multiverse, but the universe is constantly expanding. So how can it be that God is calling everything into God's self, into oneness, as the universe itself is moving outward and everything is going further apart? Except perhaps that speaks of the nature of God. This one who is infinitely loving, endlessly reaching out, whose heart, whose arms expand continuously to gather all things into God's self. Not just the good and beautiful and loving and kind moments and things, but the brokenness, the hideous things, the awful things that we do that are done to us, that we experience. All of that, God is insistent, is going to be gathered into God's wholeness and completed and redeemed and made new and whole. Does that work for you? Something to ponder when you have nothing else to think about. Susie and Justin were married in 2004. I officiated at their wedding. They have 4 children. 2 were born while we were still there, so I baptized those 2 children. And I was there when Susie's dad, Jim, died, and so I led his funeral service. Jim was a character. He's one of those people that the mold was broken after he was made, and it's probably just as well. But he was fun. You just never knew what was going to come out of him. He raised Susie by himself, and I don't remember if he was divorced or if his wife died. I do not remember, but he was a single father. And so she was a character too. He rubbed off, as would have to be the case. Well, I got an email from Susie in July, and she said, "Do you remember me? Do you remember us? And you did our wedding. You remember my dad, Jim?" And of course, I remembered him right away. When I saw the name, bingo, I could see them. And she, chatted on a little bit, and then she sort of dropped this bomb. She said that Justin, her husband, had been diagnosed in April with esophageal cancer, stage 4. And it wasn't looking good. And she had some questions for me and some requests for some assistance. And so I responded with what I could offer. And then I didn't hear from her for another couple months. And so, thinking about them and her, I sent an email just wondering how things are. And Sorry, I can't be of more help to you. Well, I got a response just this week. So my email was in October. It was almost a month later that I heard from her. And she apologized, and she had this long story to tell me. Justin loves football. He's a Vikings fan, which is sort of sad, I guess. But it's the way things are, and it's kind of like being a Cubs fan. There's just people who, I guess, like suffering. But he loved football. He played high school football, loved high school football. And their son, Chase, is a senior this year, and he's playing football. And because his dad wore number 52 on his jersey when he was in high school, Chase chose to wear number 52 on his jersey in honor of his dad. And so Susie and Justin were watching all the games. They had some connection so that somebody was there with a phone or a camera or something that could stream the game so they could watch it from Justin's hospital room, or if he was home, he wasn't strong enough to go. And so all the way along they were watching these games that Chase was playing in. And there was a big game coming up late September, early October, and it was a rematch with the team that had beat them 2 years ago in the state playoffs, and they wanted to win that really badly. It's revenge, we have to have revenge. And everybody was getting excited for this game, and in the meantime, Justin comes home because there's nothing more they can do. So he goes into hospice. And the week of this game, early in the week, he and Susie are talking, and he tells her that he had been lying in his bed looking out the window at the clouds, and he was seeing some things in the clouds that spoke to him and comforted him, some images. And then he said that God had come to him and reached out to him to bring him home, he said. Now, this is what he said. And he responded that he had one thing that he needed to do yet, if he could have time to do that. So that Friday night, Susie goes to the game because she needs to be there for Chase. And Justin's mom and sister come to stay with him because he can't be alone. And it must have been some game because it went into triple overtime. And Chase's team won in the end, and the score was 52-50. Now, whether or not that means anything at all, it was very meaningful to them. And Justin died about 8 hours later. He was 47. Susie said in the email that she thought that Chase's team had won because they had a 12th person on the field the whole game. It was another 52 was there. And that was her interpretation of things. When Jesus says this thing about the temple coming down, the end of it, and the disciples ask him, when will this be, and how will we know that all of these things are coming into completion? Jesus says what? He says, it's going to feel like the world is falling apart, like it's going to hell in a handbasket, if you will. That's not it. That's just the beginning. Because in our end is our beginning, in our time, infinity, in our doubt, there is believing, in our life, eternity. For Justin and Susie, this all comes together with a fatal illness running its course and a football game that turned out as they hoped, and this number showing up again and again and then again. And there's a sense of completion in this brokenness. And there is grief, and there is loss, and there is letting go. But there is this sense that it is somehow held in God, and that they see in these things signs of God's presence and promise that it's not over. And so life redefined and launched again for them. At least that's how she sees it. When will these things happen? And how will we know that all of these things are coming to be, are being accomplished, being completed, coming into completion? Well, I don't think it happens just once. I think this is a metaphor, and it happens again and again and again and again. So for some people, it is happening right now. For others, it already has. For you and me, well, where are things? In our end is our beginning. In our time, infinity. In our doubt, there is believing. In our life, eternity. In our death, a resurrection. At the last, a victory. Unrevealed until its season. Something God alone can see. Amen.